So just to start, if I can get my presentation to, there we go. So just to start, a little bit about me. I'm John, and I am, as Chris mentioned, an assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Natural Resource and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And so I started this just over a year ago, so I'm still a little bit new to all this, but learning a lot through the process, and I'm really excited about sort of all the things going on with fire and all the opportunities there are sort of moving forward. I'm originally from Minnesota, and I have a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I studied prescribed fire timing and its effects in tallgrass prairie restorations. So I'm sort of Midwest native, and I really consider myself to be a plant ecologist. So I spend my time pretty much thinking about like why do plants grow, where they grow, how do they respond to changes in their environment, how are the changes in the environment sort of affected by the way we manage the environment, because we really are sort of very important stewards of how all of our systems work. Um, and so that's really my background, thinking a lot about how plants are distributed across the landscape, how they change through time. I've really mostly focused on grasslands, but I've done some things in savannas that include trees, and am very interested overall in forest. But a lot of my perspective is sort of fairly grassland focused. But I think a lot of the fire ecology concepts are very similar across grasslands and forests. So hopefully there will be useful nuggets here about the forest element. And I've been sort of working in the realm of fire for a while and really thinking about both wildfire and prescribed fire in a variety of systems. So most recently actually was in Colorado, where we're thinking a lot about sort of grassland wildfires and how we predict those and where they're likely to happen. But then also thinking about how invasive species affect fire regimes in Hawaii, and then really about tallgrass prairie and prescribed fire across the Midwest in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And I want to make this disclaimer before getting too far into this that I am a scientist, I'm an ecologist, not a fire practitioner. So I'm not going to talk too much about the sort of nitty-gritty details of like safety and legality and insurance and all this kinds of stuff related to implementing prescribed fire. I'm going to talk mostly about sort of what do we know about the ecology behind sort of how fire affects our landscape and how we might be able to leverage that information for using fire to achieve management goals. And I'll provide some sort of resources that I know of more on the kind of practical front at the end of the presentation. So just as an outline of what I'm planning on going through today, first we'll talk a bit about sort of how fire has shaped our landscape overall, how it has been important in the long history of the Illinois landscape. We'll then talk about sort of what does fire do to an ecosystem, what are its effects, what kind of plants respond to fire in different ways. Then how can we use prescribed fire to reach different types of management goals? And finally, we'll talk a little bit about resources for prescribed fire, especially on private property, where that can be a little bit tricky. So, we live in a region that once saw a lot of fire. And really, historically, we think that much of our landscape probably saw fire every 1 to 35 years. And a lot of evidence suggests that it's on that much smaller side, so maybe 1 to 5 years in a lot of, especially the grasslands around here. Some other woodland areas might be a bit longer than that. And this is a pretty cool study. Now it's kind of old, almost going on 20 years old, where some researchers worked on sort of characterizing the fire regimes across our region. And so what we mean by fire regime is essentially how frequently and how severely does fire burn in a certain area. And so you might notice a lot of Illinois and the surrounding states are mostly this red color, which corresponds to areas that we think were probably mostly open grassland, tallgrass prairie, that saw frequent. So at least every 35 years, a given place would see a fire. And that it burned generally at fairly high severity, meaning that there's a decent amount of fuel that comes with tallgrass prairie that produces a lot of biomass that then when it burns can get quite hot and sort of produce a relatively high severity fire. These other orange areas are also these sort of high frequency fire regimes, but often with lower or mixed severity. And these tend to correspond to areas that have more of a wooded component, more of a tree canopy, tend to be in sort of sheltered areas where fire doesn't tend to spread as well. So sort of valleys, fire doesn't tend to go downhill very easily, or any place that fire might have been blocked by water or something like that. You get these sort of lower severity fires that might promote some more woody species growth, some more canopy. And then you get these sort of much more forested systems in the north and south that had more infrequent fires, also difference in severities depending on sort of the landscape, but also the species communities there. And we can know something about sort of this long history. This is all taking a perspective of sort of pre-European colonization. So we can kind of reconstruct this type of information from a variety of different sources of information. One that I think is pretty cool is thinking about these long-term tree records that document fire frequency through burn scars. So as a tree is growing, if a fire burns through and it damages the tree, uh, to some degree, but doesn't kill the tree, then you start to get these records where you can see a scorch mark. The tree then sort of begins to grow around that. And then when another fire comes through, it burns in, and then the tree starts to grow around it. And you get these records of looking through time over hundreds of years. When did fires occur? And so this is an example from a ponderosa pine from Oregon. So it's not local to this area, but we have these kinds of records from a number of pines around the region. And some things that are kind of interesting to note, I think, like you could reconstruct an average fire return interval by looking at how many fires happened across whatever number of years you have in this whole cross section, and see that, okay, maybe a fire occurred on average every 10 years around here. But what's kind of cool too is you can see that, all right, some time periods there's much more frequent fire than other time periods. Um, and so you can start to see that variation through time and maybe what other factors affect when fire might have been occurring more often. These fires were caused by sort of two main sources. There's a sort of a purely nature-based source that would be lightning. So thunderstorms can ignite the fuels and create fires. This definitely happened through time. But also Native Americans, the indigenous people of the region, were hugely important in affecting where and when fire occurred. And this is largely in part by sort of their activities hunting bison and other game, but also managing plant communities with fire, or even sort of harassment and warfare type activities. There are all kinds of reasons why fire was ignited on the landscape in the past by the people and the cultures that lived here before us. And really what evidence is suggesting more and more is that yes, lightning occurred sometimes, but the vast majority of ignitions through the history of sort of this landscape was caused by people. And that's has been that way for a long time, sort of until relatively recently. And there's some kind of interesting evidence that we can put together to sort of figure this out as well. This is an interesting study done by a few folks here at the University of Illinois, where they looked up actual written records from sort of the mid 1600s going to the early 1900s of fire occurrences, wildfire occurrences in sort of the Midwestern states. And they sort of found that through this time period, this curve looked sort of like this of how often fires were being recorded, at least. And there's some interesting things to learn from this. For example, these peaks that happened correspond to times when there was drought or when there was especially dry periods. So that tends to lead to more frequent fire when you have less precipitation. And then this sort of really steep decline tends to come around a time when there are more and more laws being put in place to essentially protect property from fire, because there was enough fire happening across the big open plains of this region that they needed to sort of limit ignitions to protect people's homes and property from damage. It's kind of, you don't really get the signature of what indigenous fire might have looked like from this graph, because most of the indigenous people were relatively gone from this area by the sort of early mid 1800s. And so you kind of miss out on that signature, which is a bummer, sort of, because it'd be really great to know more about what the dynamic looked like in that sort of land management era. But we can start to reconstruct that by going back further in time. And so This is another example. It's actually from Montana, so it's a slightly different system, more of a kind of mixed grass prairie system. But in this case, some researchers excavated these sort of uh, areas down into the soil, and they could sort of date the different layers of soil accumulation going back now kind of 1,000 years. So we can get a much longer term perspective of what fire might have looked like. Because you can look at these different layers going back in time and look at how much charcoal or how much sort of burned material you can find across time. And so if you find more of that, that's indicative of more fire happening during that time period. And so this is what that time series looks like going back about 1,000 years. And the red is an estimation of sort of how likely fire was to occur at these different places based on the amount of carbon or charcoal found in these deposits. And so you can see it's really quite variable through time once again, right? There are sometimes when there's peaks that there's a lot of fire, sometimes when there's very little fire. These blue areas correspond to wetter times. Um, and so you can see that generally whenever there's wet times, the fire frequency tends to really dip pretty quickly. There is this point where there's just a very short dry period that resulted in a huge amount of fire. But what I think is super interesting about this time series is that we can see a really big change, right? So after about 1650, the fire frequency declines hugely, and it just so happens to be around the time when horses were introduced to this area, which allowed for a very different kind of bison hunting. And so previously, this fire was probably really useful for controlling where bison went and sort of moving them in ways that you could then hunt them more easily. But when you could ride a horse to catch them, then you don't need to worry about that as much. And so I think this provides some really cool and pretty strong evidence of this idea that like our use of the land, the people's use of the land, and of fire really depended based on sort of the situation. And overall, I guess I just wanted to sort of make the point that people have been stewarding our landscape for a really, really long time, and that fire has been probably one of the most important tools in that sort of stewardship going back for a long time. So we have a long history of fire, and I think we're in the process of recovering back towards a system where fire is valued and used on the landscape more regularly. So, all right, so we know a little bit that fire was frequent, it really affected the landscape. And so what does it do to ecosystems? And ultimately, it is a lot of different things. For one, it really affects the type of ecosystems that you find in a place. And so here, this is another map by the same people where they've now put the sort of plant communities that you might expect to find in different places. Uh, and overlaying that with the fire frequency, you see that sort of grasslands and oak hickory woodlands are the very common ecosystem type where you have this high frequency fire, so this red and orange areas. Then you get to some of the more northern forest types at the sort of northern latitudes. Um, but this high fire frequency is what sort of makes these systems into grasslands or oak hickory woodlands, partially because these types of plants, grassland plants, and some of the trees like oaks are really fire adapted. And so this idea that plants have different adaptations to fire is really important for thinking about what kind of plants are you likely to see, what kind of systems are you likely to end up with when you have regular fire happening. And so I wanted to just run through a few of these sort of adaptations because I think they're really cool, but they're also interesting just to think about the different types of plants that fire favors. So one of the really important ones for trees is thinking about bark thickness, right? Because a tree, its growing tissues are this very narrow layer right at the outside of the sort of the forget the word for this, the interior part of the tree and the bark. So there's all the vascular tissues right on the outside. And so if you have a fire that might burn up the bark and damage that vascular tissue, that can be really bad for the tree. And so trees that live in fire systems tend to have this really, really thick bark like in bur oak. And you could compare it to sugar maple, which is a very not fire adapted species. You can see its bark is much thinner. On average. And so it's much more likely should a fire be able to get around it and be hot enough that it would be damaged by that fire. Another really cool adaptation is this idea called serotinous cones. And so these are cones that are common in a few pine species. In our region, only jack pines have this type of adaptation, uh, where the pine cones tend to remain on the stems for a long time, so they don't drop very easily, unlike most pine trees. And they're kind of like stuck closed by this like resiny sort of stuff that keeps them closed. And so all the seeds are stuck in this pine cone for a while, because only after heating or fire do the scales open up and release the seeds down into what probably is now a relatively recently burned area, because this cone needs that heat to be able to open up and release the seeds. So this is a really cool way of creating what we call sort of an aerial seed bank. The seeds are stored up in the air rather than in the soil. It makes them sort of fireproof. Um, and then it lets them be sure that when they do disperse their seeds, they're going into a relatively nice place to grow, which we'll talk about more later. Another kind of cool one with trees, especially pines, is this idea of self-pruning. And so this idea is that trees will often start to lose their lower branches. Um, and this could very well be a fire adaptation. It could be a non-fire adaptation as well, just the idea that when you have a branch lower in the canopy, it's less likely to be effective at gathering light. And so it's just not very useful to the tree anymore. So it makes sense to drop that. But also, really importantly, it might reduce what we call ladder fuels that might allow fire to get from the ground up into the tree canopy. And it's really when fire gets into tree canopies that it can cause sort of extensive mortality, because trees have so many sensitive, important tissues up in their canopy that if the fire gets up there, that can be really bad for the tree. But if it can keep it on the ground, it's usually pretty well adapted to be able to sort of resist that heat in its trunk. And so getting rid of these lower branches might be another way of sort of reducing the chance that fire gets up into the canopy, and creates a crown fire. Now, this is really important. So the leaves are kind of the litter that different plants produce is ultimately what fuels fire. And so the structure and the way that plants make these leaves can be really important in how flammable a system could be. So from a tree perspective, like oaks, for example, they create very well defended leaves. They have a lot of defensive compounds in them that tend to decompose very slowly, and they tend to sort of curl a little bit when they fall. And so this creates this sort of accumulating leaf litter layer that also has a lot of air spaces in it. And so that air allows the fire to actually burn, right? Without oxygen, fire doesn't burn. And so leaves like oak leaves tend to create this very flammable leaf litter compared to trees like maples that tend to have thinner leaves. They're less well defended, so they can decompose faster. And they also tend to be sort of flat, and they will like uh, kind of create this dense mat on the ground that just as often won't really burn, right? Because it can retain a lot more moisture. It doesn't have very much oxygen, and so it can be really, really difficult to get it to burn. Similar in grasslands, grasses are like the perfect sort of fire fuel. They create these very sort of vertical structure, very fine leaves that have a lot of air around them so they can combust quickly and they can get pretty hot to spread the fire very fast. And so grasses tend to spread fire extremely well. Compared to some of the wildflowers in grasslands, they often tend to lose their leaves fairly quickly. A lot of them tend to sort of crumble away fairly easily once they're done growing. And so they tend to produce less flammable litter. And many of their stems are almost semi-woody, like very, very dense, that can be difficult to burn. So actually, when you're burning in a grassland, it's not uncommon for you to burn up all the grass litter, but you're left with a little tiny forest of all these sort of dead wildflower stems that are left because they just don't grow or they don't burn as easily. Sort of similarly, where plants have their buds is a really important adaptation for thinking about fire. So grasses are like the prime fire fire prone species because they don't actually keep any of their actively growing buds above ground. All of their buds are kept at the soil surface or below the soil surface. And so when they lose the material above ground to fire, they're not losing these really important structures that are responsible for their ability to grow back after the fire. Whereas a lot of wildflowers, on the other hand, many do create some crown buds, but a lot of them also hold buds at sort of the tips of their branches and the tips of their growing, their main stem. And so that means that as fire comes through, they can lose these sort of valuable structures that have a lot of resources and nutrients put behind them to enable growth. And so this can set them back potentially more than a grass that wouldn't lose very many of its actual buds. And there's a really cool example of this from the southeastern US. So this, you might look at this and look like, oh, that's a really cute little bunch grassy thing. And I would tell you that it's not actually grass, it's a tree. It's a pine tree. This is a longleaf pine. And it's a very, very common canopy tree species in the southeastern US, sort of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Was once very, very abundant ecosystem, this longleaf pine savanna that was very fire prone. So it would burn probably every 1 to 2 to 3 years. And that does present a problem for trees if you think about it, because as a tree you're growing up, you have a very important sort of apical meristem, that growing point at the top of your stem that will be vulnerable to fire in the first few years of growth because you might be right there within sort of the hot flames. Um, and so how do you grow from a seedling to a full tree if you're being burned every year or two and dying every year or two? And so what this tree does is it actually stays sort of as a grass almost. It keeps its bud right at the soil surface, grows all these long needles for a few years to gather energy below ground before it then bolts and becomes what they call a bottle brush. Um, so in 1 year, it can grow a couple of feet with its reserved energy that it has below ground, so that it can then in that year hopefully get above where the fire might get to protect its above ground stem, and then grow up to be a full adult canopy tree and repeat that cycle over and over again. But you get these little grass phase trees that look just like grass, which I think is a pretty cool adaptation. And then finally, a lot of trees and other plants have sort of heat or smoke cues for germination. This is a really important way for plants to maybe know whether or not they should germinate. Because when fire goes through, if you are a seed, you may be likely to survive, but then after fire, it's less likely to happen again, and you get sort of nice environment. So it's good to start germinating and take advantage of that space and those resources and get growing. So a lot of plants sort of respond to that heat and smoke to germinate. So overall, fire just has a really strong effect on which plants thrive by favoring certain species that are well adapted to this fire. And it also has effects on the ecosystem, right? So it affects the species that might be there, but it also affects the environment. And the main way it does that is by burning up dead plant material. So it's a kind of classic disturbance that we call in ecology where it consumes material, um, opening up space and creating all kinds of changes because of that. So that, for one, it mobilizes nutrients. So all of this dead plant material has sort of leftover phosphorus and nitrogen, and it's all very kind of diluted by a lot of carbon that is sort of creating the structure. And the fire burns up a lot of these carbon compounds, but it leaves a lot of the phosphorus. Well, it leaves pretty much all of the phosphorus, and it leaves most of the nitrogen. Some of the nitrogen will sort of volatilize in the smoke, but it makes a lot of this nutrients much more readily available to plants than it would be otherwise, as it slowly decomposes from the leaf litter that it's trapped in. Um, so that's one important mechanism. You have this sort of nutrient flush after a fire. You also sort of remove all this leaf litter, which then allows the soil to warm up faster in the spring, or sort of to track the temperature more quickly when you don't have this sort of layer of dead litter on top of the soil. And that can extend the growing season, which can be great in some contexts. It can also be damaging in others. For example, if it means that you start growing before a really cold or dry period, that could be really bad for you, could be really stressful. And the lack of this sort of plant material can also mean that the soil can dry out much more quickly after a fire, which could be challenging for certain plants. I think a really important one is it just opens up space, right? It allows the soil to become more open, which then means that small plants growing from seed or regenerating have the space to grow, have access to light, and they're not being sort of as strongly competed with all these other bigger plants that have been burned away. And so it just allows a little bit of a reset in this sort of competitive situation to give more little plants the chance to have some space and have some light to get growing, which can really then potentially increase the diversity of the plant community and other things that follow. It also promotes flowering. So we have some kind of cool evidence that fire triggers more flowering effort in a lot of plants, which can be really important for a variety of reasons. For one, if you're a plant species that has like small populations, and that might require pollination to create viable seeds, um, this fire, it's really good to sort of flower at the same time so that you're more likely to attract the pollinators and to cross-pollinate each other if there's only a few individuals of you. Um, and so fire tends to cue that. It also is probably useful because when you have this nutrient pulse, that's more nutrients that could go into producing these expensive flowers and seeds, producing more seeds overall, and that can be really good for just sort of increasing the fecundity of different species. And that's just really a sort of obvious visual consequences. So these are photos. They're side by side, same day, pretty much same area. You can see sort of the similar tree line. Where it was an experiment for my PhD where we were burning at different times. And you can see this is an unburned area compared to a burned area. And there's all this dead plant material left over here. The regrowth, while it's a little bit confounded with all the brown, it's actually much smaller in this situation than this here. You can actually see some hints of flowers popping up in this plot where you have no hint of that in this plot. So you can see this just like really vigorous regrowth following fire compared to sort of being bogged down by all of this dead plant material that's left over in this prairie. And what fire does is it tends to create these cool, I think, interesting reinforcing feedbacks. So when you have this sort of closed canopy system, you tend to have more shade, which then prevents sort of grass growth and a lot of fuel accumulation. That means less fuel. That means you're less likely to burn. It maintains a closed canopy. And you get this sort of reinforcing cycle of closed canopy systems tend to stay closed canopy generally. Then if you have a more open sort of canopy system, you have more sort of sunlight available to grow more grass, essentially, is what you really need, or more of a sort of fire promoting leaf litter, like oaks and stuff. You tend to accumulate more fuel. This allows for more fire and more hot fire, which then sort of keeps the canopy open. You get this sort of reinforcing cycle that keeps a lot of canopy trees sort of from growing up and filling in, which from at least a grassland perspective, this is really important because once you get a closed canopy, it can be really difficult to get it back to this sort of open system. And across this region, we've been seeing like a pretty severe fire deficit, especially in these historically prairie and savanna type systems. So this last map here is colored by fire frequency, like departure from historic fire frequency. And so the bluer colors, more blue and green, are areas that have seen much less fire compared to what we would have expected in the past. And this is for a variety of reasons. Part of it is just that a lot of this is now agriculture, which wouldn't or shouldn't burn. And so it's just like not going to have a fire return interval that's relevant. But there's still natural systems in here that are experiencing this sort of lack of fire. Interestingly, some of the forested systems are actually sort of on pace or even getting more fire than what we might have expected in the past, probably due to this sort of fuel accumulation legacy, but also climate changing in a way that tends to promote fires with hotter and drier conditions. And so, but this lack of fire in grasslands and woodlands across this area has really changed the structure of these systems in a way that can be difficult to deal with. And essentially then what happens is when you have less fire, you start to not kill the canopy trees or the regenerating trees. You start to get a more closed canopy, which creates more shade, which creates less fuel, and you have this cycle that you end up having these open systems, more open systems that shift into these more closed systems, closed canopy systems. And when this is in a sort of wood, well, generally this lack of fire tends to allow more woody species to thrive. And this is especially shrubby species, especially a lot of our nasty invasive species um, that can really thrive in these sort of undisturbed systems. And what this ends up kind of looking like in more kind of wooded systems, we have this process that we call mesification, where you might start with something that looks like this, where you have grasses scattered around, you have a few fire tolerant trees, maybe oaks and some pines. But as you stop burning, you start to fill in the canopy with these fire adapted species, which then allows some more shade tolerant species like things like maples to start to grow in the understory. If a fire were to run through here, you'd likely kill all these more sort of shade-loving species because they don't have those fire adaptations. But if you keep excluding fire, you get more and more of these now shade-loving species that eventually sort of become the canopy as you start to lose some of the canopy, the original fire-adapted canopy through time. And you get this sort of transition to a state that is now not producing very much flammable litter. It's just it's much more difficult to get fire to go through here, and so really it's a different kind of forest now. Similar thing happens in grasslands. So this is a really interesting example. It's from Kanza Prairie in Kansas, so sort of the western edge of the tallgrass prairie. And it's in a place where they've been doing different fire return intervals experimentally for the last like 40 years. And so this management unit over here is burned every year, and this one over here is burned every 20 years. And they're right next to each other, right? So they share the environment, they share soils, they share grazers, they share everything except for that fire interval. And you can see a very distinct difference where this is now full of shrubs and small trees. And that really makes it difficult to have the same kind of fire behavior and the same kind of fire effects because these dogwoods, for example, don't create very flammable litter. These cedars have very, very dense understories, so you don't really get much growth. If you can get these to burn, they burn really, really well. But it doesn't create the same kind of spreading fire intensity that could sort of kill these shrubs and keep them out compared to this. So it can be really difficult to get back to this open 1 year state. Now this research station, they're actually now working on, okay, so we're going to stop doing this 20-year interval. We know that this does not work. Now we're going to figure out, okay, what do we need to do? A combination sort of mechanical removal, some herbicide and other things to try to kill back these shrubs and see what we can do to get the fire to come back in a way that hopefully keeps the shrubs out. And so far, honestly, the results are not looking super promising. And people are talking more and more about how do we live with shrubs more and more often is what we need to be thinking about. But anyways, in both of these cases, it's probably likely that fire itself is not enough to restore these systems. Like we need to be thinking about these other interventions that we maybe can pair with fire to get conditions where fire burns in a way that produces the outcomes that we care about, which is the sort of core of what I want to get into next. And so thinking about fire for management, really there's a lot of questions that go into sort of determining what are the ways that we should or could try to use fire for management. And so first, if it's a place that we think should or could burn, if we think it should burn, but we don't think it can burn right now, like these sort of encroached systems, we probably need to do some work to encourage enough fuel accumulation to get fire to carry and to have the kinds of effects that we might want it to have. And so this might mean thinning the canopy to let more light in or removing shrubs to just essentially encourage more flammable plant litter to grow. And so this can be done sort of mechanically or chemically. There can be a variety of different ways to do this. But something that maybe this needs to happen before even thinking about fire as a tool to use. If we think it can and should burn, then we need to consider our goals. So there can be a whole bunch of different management goals, right? We could think about increasing plant diversity or controlling problematic species, creating different kinds of wildlife habitats, potentially reducing fire risk. Maybe not such an issue here in Illinois, but definitely thinking about that further west where we get problematic wildfires pretty often. thinking about maybe promoting oak recruitment specifically. There's different ways that we could think about using fire for different types of outcomes. And really, I think this hinges on trying to align sort of what fire effects we have, which depend on our fire regime essentially. So how often do we burn? When do we burn? How hot do we try to get the fire to be? How big of fires do we try to light? All of this should affect the types of outcomes that we see after a fire. And then it's trying to sort of align those fire effects outcomes with the goals or sort of um, the, the management outcomes that we want to see. And so we could think about if we're trying to increase plant diversity, maybe we're thinking about, all right, let's try to increase the diversity of our fire regime. So burn at different intervals, at different times, to maybe start to favor species that grow at different times of the year, that maybe flower at different times of the year, and that take advantage of these sort of windows of opportunity at different times that you create by burning in the spring and in the summer and in the fall. Um, so that could be one thing to think about. For problematic species, we may be thinking about how do we determine the times when we can hit them hardest, right? So when is most of their energy above ground? When are they really investing a lot of energy that we can burn away, take away from them, and so force them to continually sort of use their energy reserves until they sort of peter out. And so that requires knowing something about the life history strategy of these species. Like we want to catch them probably before they go to seed because seeds can likely tolerate some amount of fire. And so you might not have nearly as much of an effect as you want if you were to like target them right when they're flowering or when they're growing at their fastest rate or something like that. But again, this can be difficult too because there's so many logistical constraints that also come in with this because a lot of plant species tend to grow really well when it's wet and green and really nice out. That can be difficult to get fire to spread or to find those right sort of prescription windows of opportunity to get fire on the ground. Um, so I guess also one thing I would say is that we still have a lot to learn about like how well can we kind of predict the outcomes of different fire uh, regimes or fires, period. And so a lot of this comes down to sort of experimenting and logically thinking through like what do I think should work? Let's try it and see if it does work. And if it doesn't, let's try something else and see how that changes things. I think that's kind of the fun thing about this is there's so many different ways in which this can act. That it's worth just experimenting and honestly getting fire on the ground, in my opinion, is good, I think. We should try to get as much of it as we can because we know that a lot of our systems that we really care about rely on frequent fire. And then I guess I'd also say that fire is difficult to implement. It's not something that you can just do whenever you want, however you want. There's a lot of logistics and concerns about that. So it is possible to think about other ways of implementing disturbances, right? So ways of sort of reducing biomass. Like mowing or grazing that could have similar outcomes. And so there are pros and cons here too, where it's like it might be really difficult to mow the same amount of land as you could burn in a single burn, like tens to hundreds of acres. But if you're looking at a much smaller scale, maybe mowing is an okay alternative, just to sort of open up that space and to reduce that canopy. Um, Grazing requires all kinds of other expertise and infrastructure and stuff, but it could be a really useful way of essentially consuming biomass that has a sort of similar outcome to fire. Now there'll be differences as well because you're missing the heat and those nutrient fluxes and stuff. But in general, some kind of disturbance, at least in grasslands, is better than no disturbance in almost all cases. All right, so how then do you think about implementing prescribed fire? So there are a lot of resources out there and a lot of sort of momentum and support for learning about and implementing fire. So if you're just interested in more kind of information and training, there's a variety of sources out there. So the Illinois and Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Councils are both active and have a lot of expertise and people and information available to leverage. Extension also has great information out there, and we're working on sort of building up more and more about fire, prescribed fire information in Extension. So if you have ideas of what you'd want to see, be interested in hearing that. Something you maybe haven't heard about, but there are these fire science consortia or fire science exchange networks. Um, there's one called the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna, which covers much of Illinois. Also, Lake States sort of covers parts of the kind of northeastern areas. And this is an organization that their goal is to sort of translate and link research with practice on fire. And so they have a lot of really great kind of briefs about some of the research that's been happening, but also trainings and opportunities to sort of hear webinars and conferences and stuff about fire science and how that might relate to management. You can also look into local land trusts, conservation NGOs, public land management agencies. They may offer trainings or they may offer just the opportunity to sort of go and observe or volunteer on fires. That can be a good way to get some experience. And then there's other ways of actually sort of helping private landowners, especially to get fire in the ground. One of the really cool ones that's been becoming more and more popular and is these prescribed burn associations. So what these are essentially is landowners coming together to support each other with resources and expertise to be able to expand the ability to get burns on the ground. And so I know that there are a few in Illinois and a few more in the works. And so this is a really cool thing to look into if you're excited about trying to do more burning and see if there's maybe one around your area or maybe look into starting one. And then there's always environmental contractors out there that have the expertise and equipment and ability to do prescribed fires that you can pay for. Um, and that's one way. It's more expensive, but it's definitely a fairly consistent way of getting some fire done on the ground. So yeah, just to wrap up with a few take-home messages. Our landscape has had a really, really long history of fire. Much of that has been sort of human dominated or human induced. Fire, honestly, it's pretty magical. It really changes sort of which plants might survive, the ways that plants respond. It creates this sort of very interesting change in the environment that's super good for all kinds of plants. Um, and I should mention that I didn't talk much about animal responses, and animals add a whole nother layer of complexity to all of this, where some animals really benefit from this, some animals can suffer from it. And so thinking about strategies and how those play in with animal responses is really important. Implementing fire for land management goals, I think it should consider sort of this fire regime essentially. So how often, when, how hot do you try to make it, and how big do you try to make these burns? And so how do you kind of leverage these different ways that you can affect the potential outcome, like the potential effects of fire to then create the outcomes that you're looking for. And ultimately try things. In many cases, I think fire is good for many of our systems, especially natural systems or across Illinois. And there are a lot of resources out there for more information and implementation. So check them out if you want to learn more.